Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
In almost 30 years at the tabletop, it's safe to say I've seen my fair share of rules arguments. Over time, I've been present for more than one of these arguments, such as what constitutes partial cover or when woodland terrain comes into play. I came to realize that a lot of these arguments tend to stem from the same root, line of sight, otherwise known as LOS. In Battletech, line of sight is the term we use to note what a firing unit can or can't see, and what might be in the way that could impede their shot. In Alpha Strike, the rules are a lot easier to handicap. Line of sight is based on the amount of an enemy unit that a player can physically see with their own eyes from as close to a level vantage point as possible. In Classic Battletech, though, it's a whole other animal. Back in the day, rules as written would have you placing some form of straight edge between the two miniatures on the table to determine where the LOS fell. The problem you run into there is that you've got to move your models around, sometimes the terrain gets in the way, and so you still wind up having the occasional dispute from time to time. As I seem to recall, in the late 90s, folks started using laser pointers, but these were still a far cry from the Army Painter straight-edge laser projectors we have today. Despite the straight-edge laser being a pretty cut-and-dry method for determining line of sight, I've still had to solve player arguments at the table by going to the book and quoting chapter and verse. So despite the cool factor, I guess I just can't call it the argument solver as I once did. That being said, let's take a tour out here on the space lanes as we explore the inner workings of line of sight. In Classic Battletech, the argument that you're most likely to encounter involves what's called intervening terrain, and LOS can typically only be blocked by terrain that's determined to be intervening. But it can be tricky, so watch out. This is important for determining line of sight where things like wooded hexes or smoke comes into play, and when you stack enough of these things in between you and the enemy, well, your line of sight goes away. The big thing to remember when it comes to intervening terrain is that a hex of terrain would only qualify as intervening if your target did not occupy it. Units occupying a building hex may not be able to be seen from the outside under specific circumstances, but other units inside the same building could see one another if they meet certain conditions during the weapon attack phase. Mechs can never change levels once inside a building. Otherwise, a hex containing a unit will almost never block your line of sight for the purposes of firing at that unit. When trying to determine if terrain is intervening, first ask yourself if your target is on the other side of the hex in question. If the answer is yes, then the terrain is intervening. An occupied hex can't be intervening because the target's moving around inside that hex. Movement creates more movement, and that's just enough for you to get an idea of where to point your guns when you're the shooter. Whether that works or not is another story, because of the potential penalties involved. Whether you're using a straight edge, a laser pointer, or a laser projector like I have, here's the straight dope. Page 99 of Total Warfare specifically states, any hexes through which this line passes lie along the LOS, even if the line barely crosses a given corner of a hex. You can all collectively agree to play loose and fast with that rule if you want to, but the next time somebody tells you that they've got a clean shot because the line only barely touches the offending hex, point them to page 99 of Total Warfare and tell them they're wrong. Don't worry, I'll back you up on this. But it's important to note here that the notion of where that line falls causes more arguments than just that one. So let's clear up a few more. When the line of sight traces directly down the center line in between two hexes, it's important to remember that the defender will always be the one with the option to choose which of those two hexes the LOS will trace through. In other words, the one being shot at. Where the initiative is concerned, a common misconception surrounding LOS revolves around the idea that the initiative winner will always be in the position of the defender in any given weapon attack phase, as the initiative winner always declares their fire after the loser. Don't beat yourself up too hard if you heard this one and fell for it. It's close enough to the truth to be correct, most of the time. Remember, an eagle-eyed player can always declare no fire from any of their units, and line of sight won't be checked until someone's making a shot. Even when you're the initiative winner, this scenario still puts a player employing this strategy in the position of being the defender whether you like it or not, and you in the position of being on the short end of that stick. Well boys, looks like I drew the short straw again. Remember, whatever side of the line you choose as the defender, that's the side of the line you're going to use for all the remaining shots in the turn. So make it work for you, and choose wisely.
You have chosen wisely.
The next thing it's important to remember is how terrain interacts with the LOS when your units are adjacent to it. To understand how this works, you'll first need to know how tall things are so you can get a sense of scale. You'll notice hills and other features have levels, and each level rises high enough off of the underlying terrain to provide various degrees of cover. With mechs rising 2 levels above whatever they're standing on, this is where you'll run into situations like partial cover, where only certain parts of the mech can be seen and therefore damaged. However, elevation matters. Whenever you're firing at a target of lower elevation than yourself, the partial cover is negated. So remember, the next time someone tries to claim partial cover on you when you're firing on them from higher ground, just tell them I said, "Not today, tiny Satan."
My Satan sense is tingling.
A tank only rises 1 level above any terrain it's currently sitting on. Partial cover won't exist. With tanks, when it comes to LOS, there's no half measures. You either got it, or you don't. However, it's important to remember here that under the Total Warfare rule set, adjacent units can always see one another, with one exception. Keep in mind that we're just talking about mechs and tanks in this video, but you can apply these same metrics to other unit types across the board, and the rules will still work the same way. Where wooded hexes are involved, remember that trees also rise 2 levels above the underlying terrain. This means a mech standing adjacent to, but not occupying a wooded hex will still get the benefit of the cover those woods provide, even if an enemy unit is firing at them from an elevated position. This is because the woods and the mech are the same height, and if the LOS traces through a wooded hex adjacent to the mech, the woods are tall enough to partially obscure your vision. This only matters if your target is adjacent to the woods. Have no fears, for as it works for the enemy, it also works for you. This is a double-edged sword, however. A wooded hex adjacent to your mech will provide you with cover from incoming fire, but they'll also bother your aim on the return shot as well. Remember, the elevation of your target is immaterial here, because you're adjacent to the woods, and they are, therefore, in your face. And sometimes you're just gonna have to pay the cost to be the boss, same as the enemy. The same thing applies to hills as well. If your target is adjacent to a hill or other feature that's equal in height or taller than it is, check your LOS line. If the offending feature lies along the LOS, you won't be able to see that target from that angle, even if you're firing at it from an elevated position. The only other way to see it is if you're adjacent to it. Where partial cover is concerned, the penalty will only be applied when the target is adjacent to the hill or other terrain feature. If you're like me and you play with a lot of 3-dimensional terrain, sometimes terrain features have sizes that aren't well defined in terms of how many levels tall they should be, so in those instances, what I suggest to you is to note their height beforehand where all players can agree prior to gameplay. What we like to do over here is to measure a building against a mech or 3. We know the mech rises 2 levels above the ground, so that's an easy way to make a guesstimate if you aren't sure. Water is the exception to a couple rules. It provides partial cover to a mech even if the attacker is at a higher elevation, and it blocks line of sight completely to and from any mech that occupies a water hex of depth 2 or greater, even if you're adjacent to it. And if you're driving your tanks into the water, I don't want to be on your tank crew. In as far as buildings go, it can get kind of weird if you're not used to it, so hang on. When your target occupies a building hex from the inside, the outer wall of the building won't impede your shot. However, if your target moves down or falls down into a basement inside that building, you're dealing with sublevels. Sublevels follow all the same rules for LOS as normal, with the following exceptions made for buildings. A standing mech occupying a level 1 building or a building hex 1 level below the roof receives partial cover even if its attacker is at a higher level. If the hit location roll indicates a leg, the attack strikes the building instead, damaging it as normal. So with that being said, it's a viable strategy to crash through the walls of a level 1 building and use the ruins for partial cover. The damage you'll take entering the building is a small risk to potentially save you from taking a whole lot more, and you're even protected from attackers firing at you from an elevated position. Multiple non-mech units inside the same building may potentially be able to see one another, so long as they're both on the same level of that building. Every now and again, standing behind things isn't always the better option, and sometimes you just gotta bust through. For partial cover...
Oh no! Oh yeah!
So the next time you find yourself across the tabletop with a line of sight dispute on your hands, I hope this video is able to help you resolve those disputes in a friendly way, but with finality on your side as well. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever had any crazy line of sight disputes at your tabletop? Tell me your thoughts and feelings in the comments section below, and don't forget to share this video with your favorite mecha nerds. If you like what you've seen so far, do us a big favor and hit that subscribe bell. Turn on all notifications so you can find out exactly where Battlebound's gonna turn up next. And Battlebound has a Patreon at patreon.com/battlebound. Sign up today to enjoy those benefits tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Tuckdavian, and I'm sure looking forward to seeing you next time right here out on the Space Lanes.
Be sure to smash our like button and subscribe to our channel.
Crowdfunding is when lots of people give you small amounts of money to help your passion project come to life.